Welcome back to this week's episode of the Lady Landlords podcast. I am your host, Becky Nova, and today we're going to be talking about how to be the best self-manager of your properties you can absolutely be. So, if you've been listening to our episodes, you probably heard last week's episode where I interviewed Colin from Atlas Property Management all about how to find and use a property manager if that was the route you were going. But I know a lot of you out there were really hoping to learn a little bit more about how to self-manage yourself. So I figured we will dedicate today's episode to exactly that. I want to walk you through the different steps that you need to do before, during, and after to make sure that you're managing your properties the best. Now, if you are new to Lady Landlords or new to our podcast here, just to share a little bit about me, I've actually gone about both routes. My husband and I own properties in New York where we currently live, and we own quite a few multifamilies here, in addition to also owning property in the Dominican Republic. We have not only used property managers, especially for the property that is out of the country, but we also then self-manage our properties in New York while we are living in the Dominican Republic during the winter. So I have experience with definitely doing that long distance management, as well as also properties that are quite a bit closer to you. I personally am currently house hacking. So that means that I have a multifamily that I live in where my husband and I live in one unit and we rent out the others. So we do have tenants that are in very close proximity to us. And I also own a property right across the street from where I currently live. We own a 4-family across the street there. So we also end up seeing our tenants quite a bit when we are in our neighborhood. So we definitely have experience with doing it both ways. And as I mentioned in last week's episode, this is really a personal preference. You have to decide which way that this is going to work best for you. One of my little tips that I can give you, one thing that my husband and I do, is we make sure when we are purchasing properties to factor in and analyze our deals, including property management and then not including property management, just in case we ever want to make a change, which we probably will do at some point in the future. Then we have that availability and we know that we will still have that cash flow and still have that room to be able to pay for somebody else to manage our properties. So if you have not listened to that episode, make sure to go back, listen to the episode before this one, last week's, to learn more about property managers, how to work well with them, how to find the best property manager, and a lot of other questions that could be very helpful for you there. But today we're talking all about if you are going to do this yourself. So it all starts at the very beginning. You have to, even before you have your tenants moving in, you have to start thinking about how your property management is going to work. And you need to make sure that you are running things right from the start. A great way to do that is to screen really, really well. So I have an entire episode also here in the Lady Landlords podcast all about screening your tenants. So I will link that episode down in the show notes. But otherwise, please make sure to go back and find that episode just a little bit more about screening tenants themselves. But the reason you want to start off in the beginning is because this is still a relationship business, just as much as it is when you're working with a realtor or a seller finding off-market deals or doing seller financing. It really is a people's business. So that's why it's incredibly important to make sure that you have the screening set from the start. One of the ways to do that is you want to make sure to understand your fair housing laws, the laws of your state, the laws of your city or town, and make sure you understand what you need to do and are responsible to do as a business owner. When you are a landlord, when you own properties and own rentals, you now are a business owner. Congratulations. But that does come with its own set of regulations. So make sure that you are going through and you're educating yourself on what those look like. One of the other things that's important here is to set your criteria. This is something that's going to really help you when it comes to dealing with your fair housing laws. You need to make sure that you are reviewing all of the different candidates across the board in the same fashion with the same criteria. What I mean by that is when you receive an application, you should not at that time be looking at it being like, oh, well, this person makes this amount of money. The other person makes more money, so that clearly is going to make them better. Or saying, well, this person's credit score is only this number. I don't know if I want to take that or not. No, you have to have your criteria set. You have to have that standardized because you have to hold all applicants amongst your pool against the same criteria. So make sure that you want to set your criteria first according to your fair housing laws. Now, you might be saying, Becky, how do I do that? How do I know what those things are? Don't worry, I'm here to help. If you are listening to this episode, which is being released on October 19th, we actually are going to have a fair housing laws workshop and all about tenant management. So I will put the link down in the show notes about that as well. Make sure you sign up for that workshop. It is coming up soon. We already have a wait list that is growing with over 50 different participants that'll be joining us. So make sure you get on that list today, because that date is going to be announced later this week. So what we're going to talk about on that webinar is really making sure that you know how to set the criteria, that it is something that definitely works for the neighborhood that you own properties in, the type of applicant pool that you have, and something that you know that you will be able to still find applicants coming in, and you're not going to have to worry about anybody claiming that you are not following fair housing laws. So that's incredibly important. So once you know those and once you can set your criteria, then you want to start thinking about how are you going to screen those tenants. My recommendation, as you will hear from our tenant screening episode, is all about how to use a pre-screening questionnaire to make sure that you are only then working with those that you know are actually going to be able to rent your property. So that pre-screening questionnaire definitely helps you narrow down the right people. And then you want to make sure to have that great application so that way you can determine if that tenant is going to be the right tenant for your rental property. I'm going to link down bottom to not only my pre-screening questionnaire, I'll also share with you my application, anything I can do to really support you here. I am happy to share all the resources that I use. So please make sure to go look through the show notes here and I can get that organized for you. Also, after then you're able to screen those people. After then you now have your pre-screening, you showed people the property that were already qualified. Now you get them in and they are able to view the apartment and then make the decision if they want to use that application. Once they apply and you select your tenant, now it's time where you really need to make sure to have your lease be absolutely fantastic. The reason for that is because your lease is a contract. That is your agreement between yourself and the tenant on what is really expected, and not just of them, but also of you. It really works both ways. Having that lease lay out all of that information is a great way to ensure that you're going to set up that relationship, not only from a business perspective, but you're going to have really clear expectations for all parties involved. This is a great way to really be able to avoid issues later on, because you can always go back and reference the lease, and that really helps diffuse situations. What I mean by that is in certain situations, we've seen this many times in the Lady Landlords Facebook group, people will make comments about, well, we have this problem with their tenant, or who's responsible for this, or what should happen with this. Well, no, all of those things should then be already laid out in your lease. So it really sets the tone there, make sure that it really gives instructions. Then that way, if you have a tenant all of a sudden that's saying, well, no, I don't want to do this, I think that's your responsibility, landlord. It's great because you can actually go back and reference that lease and say, hey, this is what you signed. This is what we agreed to. And look, here is everything that you needed to know about this situation. It's already been agreed to. So it really helps make sure to keep your relationship with your tenant going and diffuse some of those situations where things might be a little gray, but your lease is black and white. So those are things to do before. Let's now talk about what to do when you get your tenants already into that property. Here is a great opportunity to implement systems. This is something that has incredibly helped me. I felt like when my husband and I bought our first property and I was just kind of running around trying to be able to answer questions or deal with the things that they needed. What I mean by that is I didn't necessarily have my lease ready to go. I didn't have that pre-screening questionnaire ready to go. So I felt that I was just running around trying to grab absolutely everything that I could to put together some semblance of being a landlord. And that didn't necessarily work, especially as we continued to grow. Maybe it worked for having one tenant, but now having multiple tenants and multiple apartments and multiple rentals, it really just wasn't going to work anymore. So what was really important was to make sure that I knew exactly where I was going to get my lease from, exactly what it was going to say, exactly how I was going to do my screening, and put all of those things together. When now I have tenants move in, one thing that's incredibly important is to discuss maintenance items. So we've all kind of heard that crazy idea of having tenants call you in the middle of the night because there's some problem with the toilet or God knows what else. But when you're able to have a system in place for what to do for those maintenance items, this will make your life so much easier when you're self-managing. So, for example, make sure to have a plan of what tenants are supposed to do when they have an issue. For example, one of the things that my husband and I do is we actually have business hours just like anybody else would. So we have a joint email that will go to both of us that our tenants are given in their lease so they know exactly who to reach out to. And it makes it very clear about when that email is monitored, when they should expect a response from that email, and what is the next steps in our process for maintenance. For example, a lot of times when tenants are requesting maintenance or service to their apartments, sometimes we really need to verify what is really the problem and what's really kind of going on with that. That might mean that my husband or myself will have to go over and review the problem, or it's something that we end up sending a handyman for before possibly then having to go to a more skilled service or a licensed vendor. So we make it very clear what that process looks like and what the tenant can expect from the very onset of this, but it is the same system that all of our tenants adhere to. We also make it very clear, as some of you might have heard what I just said and be like, what's going to happen if there's an actual emergency? We also make it very clear from our lease what that emergency process should look like, what situations they should be calling us for, and what they can also expect from us at that time. So now what I've done is I've made sure that I have my regular hours set up, that I'm dealing with any maintenance issues. But then I know that if I get a phone call from one of my tenants, I know that there's something going on because they already have that understanding of what really constitutes as an emergency and then how I'm going to respond by that. So that way they can feel confident that I'm going to answer the phone and be able to support them through whatever the emergency situation it is. One of the other things that systems really helps with is making sure that we do quarterly inspections. This is where my husband and I will go and actually view the apartment. We make it very clear when we're going to be coming to the apartments or our rental property. We also make it very clear what we're going to be looking for. Inspections can be a very scary word. Remember that when your tenants are in these properties, it really is their home. That is where they are residing. That is where all of their personal belongings are. And they're really the ones spending the time in that state, in that space. For me, we own the house, we own the walls, but it really is the tenant's home. So we want to make sure when we do inspections, two things happen. One, they're very clear about when we're coming, but two, also what we're looking for. We are not coming in to judge what their apartments look for. We're not coming in to check what they've been doing or look up on them. What we're really coming and looking for during those inspections is for anything that could possibly violate our leases, but also anything that we need to do maintenance for. We don't want to find out a year later, 2 years later, that there was a leak someplace and our tenants just didn't want to bother us or they didn't think that it was a big deal. We want to get in and we want to make sure to be able to protect our asset, which is once again the house, and make sure that at that time we can do any of the updates or any of the repair work that we need. Then that's going to create a happier tenant, which means that hopefully they will still there, they will stay longer with us, which is always great when your tenants want to stay longer. The least amount of turnover you can have really does tend to translate into better profitability for landlords. So this is a great way to keep them there and make sure that we are also taking care of our asset. There is nothing worse than when you have a tenant move out years later and you just see the amount of work that has to be done. My husband and I actually just got back from viewing some properties earlier today, and you could tell that really there has not been a lot of maintenance on those properties. And honestly, the seller probably isn't going to get as high of a number as he was hoping for selling his apartment, because there's a lot of work to be done that he really could have done throughout those different times. So hopefully that's going to be a win for my husband and I in negotiations. But for those of you that are planning on selling your properties at some point in the future, this is why it's important to make sure to be doing maintenance consistently throughout the time, even when your tenants are there. But the best time to really do those larger items of any type of upgrades or larger maintenance items would be at that turnover. So let's now switch gears a little bit into self-management for after a tenant is moving out. This is another great place to have processes put in place. The reason for that is because it can get a little uncomfortable when all of a sudden a tenant decides to leave. Maybe they're leaving because you decided not to renew their lease, or maybe they decided to move on for whatever reasons happened and changed in their lives, that they then are going to be vacating the property. We want to make sure to continue great communication with our tenants throughout that time. And we want to make sure that we can make that process go as smoothly as possible. So another great place to have a process here, I actually have it laid out in my lease, exactly what would happen with the security deposit. It goes through what that move out checklist looks like. It goes through our entire process of what they would expect their security deposit to look like, what I expect in order to return a full security deposit, and also the time frame that they would receive it in. This is also a good reminder of making sure to know your laws, because in different areas, you do have different time frames and different ways of different things that you can and cannot charge for in the returning of a security deposit. So do make sure to check those out, or once again, join our webinar coming up in a few weeks. So when you now have those processes put in place for after the tenants are moving out, you also want to make sure that you know what turnover is looking like. That means, right, you're kind of starting that whole process over again. So that's why it's really important to have your ad ready to go for your apartments or your rental properties. You want to make sure to have photos, possibly professionally taken or very good photos, already ready to go. And one of the things that I've learned to do over this past year is to also do video walkthroughs. So I'm able to do that where I can now send to a potential applicant a video really showing them what the entire property looks like. That will buy me some time if I have to do some improvements between tenants. The improvements we usually do would mean painting, fix anything that's there. Possibly most of my properties actually are all hardwood floors, but you would definitely need to either redo or to shampoo carpets, anything else that you need to be able to get that property ready for the next person. You can be doing those things because you already have your pictures, your videos already set. So then that way you're not really sending any pictures that don't look great to the next possible applicant. So that will help you really save time and be able to get that fast turnover to get that next tenant in sooner than later. One of the other things to consider here is to make sure if you are going to do improvements, you know what you're doing and who you're doing them with. So it's really good if you can start to build up your team that you know you can go to be able to do this work. So it does take some time, definitely, to go through different contractors. You can actually read a little bit more about finding the best contractor for you on our Lady Landlords website, lady-landlords.com. And reading in the blog, I have an entire blog about how to find the perfect contractor for you. It's a great opportunity to make sure that you have on speed dial the right people for the different roles that you will need to get this turnover done. It's also, when you're talking about these improvements, yes, you have to do those things to get the apartment ready for the next person, right? As we mentioned, painting, carpets, any type of that wear and tear. But this is also a good opportunity, especially if you've had a tenant there for quite some time, to think about what other improvements that you can make that will be what's called an IPA. That's an income producing activity. Income producing activities is really what will make a difference on if you're able to then get a higher rate than what you were charging before. But you have to look at what else in your market dictates including a higher rent. What I mean by that is you need to see what else is standard. So for example, maybe when you first rented that apartment 5 years ago, the entire neighborhood, everybody had white appliances, and that was very typical in the area. But over the years now, you've noticed that everybody really is offering their properties with stainless steel appliances. This might be the time for you if it's been a couple of years and maybe something's not working with the old stove or the refrigerator. It's a great time to be able to upgrade those things, but you want to make sure that it's going to be able to help you get a higher rent. So it's a great time to either yourself go through some comps and see what other rentals are actually renting for, or this is a time definitely to loop in your realtor. There is nothing wrong with still self-managing, but having a realtor help you with renting out that property and getting you through that screening process. So if that is the way that you go, make sure to confer with a realtor and know what upgrades to an apartment can help you get a higher rent. And then you really just have to do your cost benefit analysis there and see if putting that money into those particular upgrades is worth the amount of money that you would make higher in rent. To explain that a little bit more, if I have to go and put in, change the countertops, change the cabinets, change all the appliances, even though they're still new and work perfectly fine, and I'm going to spend a good couple $1,000s for that, but it's really only going to get me a rent that maybe is $50 higher, well, I'm probably not going to make those upgrades. That doesn't actually fit that analysis on if it would make sense for me to do those things. To me, I would not consider them income producing activities. So I'm going to stay with where I am. And then I just want to make sure that I'm still staying with market rents as best I can. So then at that point, it's really just going on repeat. Now all of a sudden you're back in that before mode where you're screening your tenants, and you can keep going through this system over and over again. You will continuously be learning different strategies and different best practices for communicating with your tenants along the way. And that's something that my husband and I have really taken into consideration every single time we have a new person move in or out of our properties. So think about those and what you can do to always make sure that you're giving your tenants a great customer experience and keeping them there for a longer period of time. So once again, if you are interested in joining our tenant management course coming up soon, make sure to join our wait list down in the show notes. And I will see you back here for our next episode of the Lady Landlords podcast. We release a new episode every single Tuesday. So make sure to subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts, and also here on YouTube if you are watching the video version of this. See you all back in the Lady Landlords Facebook group.